Hi there again. We're on our last video about work and vocation with Scott Rae. The last video we want to create is one giving tips to people in the workplace, but also people transitioning out of study, out of school, to consider what sort of work they might be engaged in. So the first question I have, you've written a book about moral choices. I want to know, what are some of the moral choices that Christians should consider when they're thinking about applying for a job? Yes,
okay.
I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Part of it, I'd say, they're not necessarily moral questions, but they're practical ones.
Yes.
And that is, what am I good at? What are my skills? What are my gifts? What am I passionate about? Although I think we probably need a note of realism on this, that it may be that the things that you are most passionate about are not the things that you're going to be able to make a living at. Mm-hmm. So that doesn't always dovetail. I think the advice to follow your heart and then the money will come is not always true. Mm-hmm. Because you may be following your heart into an arena where there's just not a market for that to make a living at. So I'd be prepared for that. It may be that what you will do in the workplace may not be the heart of your calling, but it may be part of it. Mm-hmm. So in terms of the moral choices that people have to make, we really encourage our business students to ask questions about the moral environment of the companies that they're interviewing with and the kinds of organizations that they're looking for. Because it's really important that an organization is structured in a way that is conducive to moral behavior. So some of the things that we encourage people to watch out for are organizations that have really strong command and control structures tend often not to be places that are conducive to moral behavior, because there's no room for people to ask questions and to question authority. Groupthink tends to emerge in places like that. We also encourage people to ask about, what kind of code of ethics does the company have? Is there a profession-based code of ethics? Does the company have it written down somewhere? What exactly are the moral requirements that are expected of employees? And then we urge them to ask questions to see if that code of ethics is just something that's on the wall and they've lip service to it, or does it really matter? Is there ongoing education to deal with it? Do the people at the top, the people who sign your checks, do they model that effectively? Some of those questions you have to ask to people who are not in your official interviews, but who are just people who you may know in the company or who you may seek out outside the official channels. And usually we encourage, it's not uncommon for people to experience some sort of moral tensions in the companies that they work with. We encourage folks at the first whiff of that not to run, not to go look for another job, but to hang in there and to keep your place at the table, because if you walk away at the first hint of moral tension, chances are the person who replaces you will not have nearly as sensitive a conscience as you do. Mm-hmm. And so if followers of Jesus are abandoning certain industries or certain professions, then those professions go on without the light of Christ in them, mm-hmm. and without the salt and light that the believing community can be. In the U.S., we've seen that happen with the entertainment industry, mm-hmm. And now it's become increasingly difficult for believers to break back into that. And so I say be very careful about what you leave. That's not to say that there aren't certain times under certain conditions when you ought to walk away from your job. If it's really producing a faith-compromising, witness-tarnishing environment for you, then that's something you have to really seriously consider walking away from.
Mm. What do you think some of the dangers or even idols Christians might have when considering applying for a particular job?
Well, I actually think that the temptation to idolatry is it's a human vice. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say it's necessarily related any more or less to any specific occupation, because I know pastors who have made an idol out of their churches.
Yeah.
But it is entirely possible that someone can get most of their identity out of where they do their work, when ultimately our identity comes from being in Christ and being in our community. I don't think it's inappropriate for your work to provide a level of satisfaction and security, and even, partly define who you are, because it's how in reality, it's how you spend most of your waking hours. So it's not realistic to think it's not going to define at least part of who you are. Mm-hmm. But if it defines you in such a way that you were lost without it, or you couldn't consider, changing jobs or doing something different without it crushing your identity, then I'd say that's something to be concerned about. I think the other thing that relates to business is, for a person who's very successful, who makes a lot of money, I don't think there's anything biblically prohibited with making a lot of money. I do think that to whom much is given, much is expected. And the temptation is to think that what God has blessed me with, I've actually pulled off on my own. Mm-hmm. I'd want to be very careful about that, because those tables have a way of turning pretty quickly if people start thinking too highly of themselves. And I want to be careful that you look at your career primarily in terms of what you're going to be doing for the good of your communities, as opposed to how this is going to be serving yourself. Usually we distinguish between callings and careers based on what you are doing. A calling, the focus is on what you're doing to be of service. The career is more about the ladder that you're climbing and the steps that you're taking to get to where you want to go. Mm-hmm. And there will always be somebody with a higher position, with more money, with more success. So that climbing that ladder, I think, is ultimately futile, as my mentor in seminary put it. He said, you can get to the top of the ladder, but you'll find out that it's leaning against the wrong wall. Mm-hmm. And so the person who has climbed to the top of their field but is a miserable failure at home, maybe on their third marriage, alienated from their kids, I would say, regardless of that person's professional success, they're a failure at life. Mm-hmm. A friend of mine who I teach with, his first law partner that he was working with was on his third marriage. None of his kids were speaking to him, and when he had a heart attack, the only person he could talk him into taking him home from the hospital was his secretary. Mm-hmm. You think, great professional success, dismal failure at life. Mm-hmm. Climbed to the top of the ladder, found out it was leaning on the wrong wall. That's what we want. We want the folks who are just now transitioning into business. Now's the time to be setting those habits and those patterns so you don't end up going down that road.
Yeah. What do you think of the term work-life balance? Is it something you agree with? Or is there a better way to articulate how we are faithful in all the different vocations and responsibilities in life?
I think that's a better way to put it, actually.
Answer my own question.
Yeah. I think this is where we might get the idea of vocation not quite correct, because your vocation and your occupation are not the same thing. Your vocation is simply an arena of service to which God has called you, which means we have multiple vocations that we're obligated to all at the same time. I have a vocation as a husband, father, professor, church member, neighbor. I also think I have a vocation to another part of the world. Seems like Australia seems to be one of those.
Yes, Australia is calling you at the moment.
Which I'm delighted to be here. But I don't think that the idea of work-life balance implies that you can have it all. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that's possible. I think people who are incredibly successful, that's all-consuming. And people who want to have really good families, that takes a lot of being there. Mm-hmm. You just, you can't have a great family and not show up for all the important stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think the myth that our culture has sold us is that you can have it all without having to make choices. I just don't think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to make choices. And the people who are at the top of their profession, I think will tell you that they've made hard choices along the way, and some of which they look back on with regret. And for somebody who's in their 20s, I would want to say to you, please be careful that you don't get to your 50s and look back and think, I've just made major mistakes here in the choices I made. I spent about 10 years when my kids were playing a lot of sports, and I was coaching their sports, where I didn't go to any professional meetings. I didn't take any speaking engagements that involved overnight travel. And I didn't write much. I basically taught my classes and then was with my kids.
Mm-hmm.
And I look back, I don't have any regrets about that, because I don't have to be afraid of the day coming when I look back and say, oh, shoot, I missed it. I missed my kids.
Mm-hmm.
I have a great relationship with all of them today. And would I have been able to do more professionally? Yes. But those were choices I made. And I'm glad I made them. I don't look back on them. I'm grateful I have some faculty colleagues who have kids that age now who are following that lead, and I'm encouraging them to do that. And it means having boundaries and saying no to things that are good things, but they're not as good as some of these other things that God's calling me to at the same time.
Well, thank you for your time, Scott. You can find out more about the Talbot Center for Faith, Work and Economics via the link on the screen. Thanks for your time, Scott.
My pleasure. Samantha, good being with you.